So here we are, it's October. You likely don't have snow in your school garden yet, but this is a beautiful photo. But we are feeling a big seasonal shift out there. Our harvest is often wrapping up and we're starting to think about tucking the garden in for winter. You might also be thinking about season extension, thinking about some of those vegetables that are still in your garden that you want to protect. You might also be noticing as the weather gets chilly and wet that it's getting a bit more challenging to think of interesting ways to keep students engaged and comfortable in the outdoor garden classroom. So these are all topics on our mind today, and we're excited to be able to discuss them in this workshop. For those of you that I haven't met, my name is Tessa, and I'm the Island Region Coordinator with Farm to School BC. I previously worked as an outdoor educator, a classroom teacher, a community coordinator, and a farmer. And I love my job because I get to do all these things under one job title now, so it's great. As we start this workshop, I would like to acknowledge that today I am calling in from the traditional and unceded territory of the Cowichan Nation, who have lived here since time immemorial. As a second-generation settler living on this land that's been the lifeline of past Cowichan generations and future generations, it's my commitment to be part of reconciliation in this community. It'd be great to hear where other folks are calling in from. If you have a moment, please share and chat the territory that you're calling in from. That would be wonderful. Before we start, I'm just going to share a really quick background about Farm to School BC. Farm to School BC is a program that brings healthy, local, sustainable food into schools across BC. We provide students with hands-on learning opportunities that develop food literacy, and we strengthen local food systems by striving to enhance school and community connectedness. Farm to School BC is a program of the Public Health Association of BC, and we're supported by the province of British Columbia. And here we are. This was the year of the School Garden Mentorship Program, and we're now at the last one, October 15th. If you have missed any of these workshops throughout the year, we have all our recordings, our slide decks, and our resource sheets on our website. So hop on over and take a look at these topics if you've missed them along the way. Okay, time for a workshop today. I'll be starting with an overview of some of the key things to consider when you're winterizing your garden, when you're tucking your garden in for the winter. And also talk about extending the season if you're wanting to protect some of the crops that are still in the ground. And there's a few crops that you still have time to plant too, so we'll talk about fall planting. But I'm going to keep this intro brief as we do because we have an amazing community mentor joining us today from the Cowichan Valley. We're delighted to have Naomi on the call as our community mentor. As the season gets chilly and wet, as I mentioned, it can be harder to imagine fun, engaging activities for students in the garden. And so Naomi's here today to inspire us with themes and lesson ideas for the garden classroom in October and November. Naomi's the manager at KinPark Youth Urban Farm, which is an initiative of the Cowichan Green Community. Naomi started at the park in 2019 and has been working with youth of all ages ever since, offering programming in their year-round market garden and the surrounding gardens, which has a food forest, a mini orchard, and a native meadow restoration site. Naomi also facilitates programming in a nearby elementary school and facilitates other programming in schools throughout the year. So Naomi's amazing wealth of knowledge when it comes to engaging students in the school garden year round. So we'll hear from her later on and we'll be excited to have her on the call. But before we get to that, I just want to give kind of an intro to a few of the topics that are very timely for October in the school garden. So big job that we have this time of year is starting to do garden cleanup. It can feel like the garden's winding down, but it's an amazing time to still bring students out into the garden to get their help with fall cleanup. You really want this time of year to be able to set your garden up, to have the amazing natural services of decomposition and soil building that can happen all winter long if you give it the right conditions. All the work that you put in the fall and cleanup can make a huge difference to planting in the spring and having that soil ready to go. Garden cleanup's also really nice to have the help of many hands. It's really purposeful, meaningful work to engage students in. And I think it can help create a student sense of connection to the garden as the year progresses into the winter. Decomposition, I think, is also just a fascinating topic for kids. There's a lot of just like natural inquiry and inquisition when we look at how things decompose and insects that are part of that. So it's also just a great topic that has a lot of natural interest from students. I like to approach garden cleanup with a less is more approach. It's really tempting to want to remove all the debris in your garden, have this like tidy aesthetic. But what you're doing is you're actually stripping a lot of nutrients and insect habitat when you do that. Kind of an example of this, just to get our brains thinking about how this works. That picture on the slide on the bottom right-hand corner is a raspberry cane. And there's native bees that actually use those raspberry canes in winter to burrow into and overwinter in. That's a picture of a carpenter bee. So as we're thinking about cleanup, we also want to think about leaving those insect homes intact in the garden. all that material in your garden is also full of nutrients. So the more of those nutrients that we can get decomposing and going back into the soil, that'll really enrich your soil for spring planting. We do want to help speed up that decomposition process. If we just leave all our plants as they are, it can take a long time for them to decompose. So we like to do something we call chop and drop, which is it's basically speeding up decomposition by taking all the plant material that's still in the garden, chopping it up into small pieces, letting it fall onto the soil surface, which provides a mulch, covering the soil, protecting the soil, and then those pieces also decompose quickly into the soil, creating new soil. As you're thinking about chopping and dropping, you want to also think about what things might we want to use for next year. The picture at the top, there's this old sunflower stalk, and those stalks are incredibly sturdy. So they're great material to use for staking. Maybe you have pole beans you're growing in your garden or other things that need support. So get creative too with what resources you might have in your garden that you want to save. There is an exception to this kind of less is more chop and drop approach. Some plants do carry diseases or pests in the garden. A couple common ones, tomatoes often carry a blight this time of year as they get wet. So you want to watch for that. Squash, sometimes even kale gets a powdery mildew, this kind of like white film on the leaves. So if you do see any disease in the garden, that would be an instance where you'd want to actually remove those plants from the garden. You don't even want to put them in your compost because that disease can spread. You want to remove them right from the site. You also want to look for pests. I find sometimes when flowers go to seed, when plants go to seed, they can be much more susceptible to pests. So just be mindful of some things you would want to get out of the garden. Once you've done your chop and drop, it's time to add even more mulch to your garden. This is probably my favorite activity. If you're going to do one fall activity, I really recommend putting leaf mulch on your garden. Your spring self will be so thankful for all the insect habitat you've created, all the suppression of weeds that's happened, and this beautiful rich soil that you'll find underneath that leaves. Leaves add a lot of organic matter. They add minerals, they add aeration for the soil, they warm the soil in the winter, and they provide habitat for all those decomposing insects that are doing their job, turning those materials into soil. There's lots of different types of leaves you can use, and schoolyards often have deciduous trees around them that you can collect those leaves from. Maple leaves are the perfect carbon-nitrogen ratio to build soil, but lots of different leaves can work as well. If you have a ton of leaves, too much to fill your garden beds, what an amazing problem to have. You can save those leaves by making a leaf compost, and this is just a really simple, often like a wire kind of ring, which you can fill up with leaves, and those leaves will heat up and decompose within that container, and they'll make a beautiful thing. We often call it leaf gold or leaf mold, and that's a compost that you can spread back on the soil. Lots of schools can't have compost because of concerns with rodents, with decomposing food waste, but there's usually an exception for things like leaves because they're not an animal attractant like other types of compost. So if you are wanting to do some studies in compost and have that as part of your literacy in the garden, this is a great example, a great opportunity to bring composting into the garden. Maybe you don't have deciduous leaves handy on site at your school, so there's some other options that I've seen schools that still want to provide some leaf mulch for their garden. I've seen schools do a fundraiser where they go out and they rake neighbors' yards and then they bring those leaves back to their garden. It can be a really nice community connection. I've also seen schools do leaf drives where they ask parents if they have leaves in their gardens to bag them up and bring them into the school garden, another great way to connect community. Some local municipalities will drop leaves off. They do their own leaf collection and composting, and they'll donate to school gardens, to community gardens, that beautiful leaf mulch that they make. So you can check in with your local municipality if that's an option too. When you are getting donated leaves, you do want to think about safety and contamination. You want to think about the messaging that you're sending out when you're asking for leaves to come to site. Here's just an example of some of the messaging you might want to think about. So what leaves you do want and what leaves you don't want to be provided on site. So you want to just consider the communication that goes out around something like a leaf drive. As you're leaf mulching, it's also a great opportunity to dig a bit more into learning and teaching about leaves and decomposition. If you're looking for some resources to support that, the Compost Education Center in Victoria is an amazing educational place that offers a lot of fact sheets, and one of their fact sheets is directly on urban leaves. They also offer fact sheets on mulching and composting at schools. So yeah, head on over to the Compost Education website and look at the fact sheets. As I'm talking, Madison is popping these links into the chat bar too. So if you haven't opened up chat, you'll see all those links going in. We also share all those resources at the end too. If you want to dive deeper into how leaves work in that decomposition process and how they build up the soil, SPECS, which is an organization in Vancouver, has great online resources around leaves. This is a lesson plan, how leaves work. They have a whole nature school online where they have a lot of great resources. So you can also look at some of the other resources that they have. When we're thinking about mulch and soil building, I also think this is a really natural time to shift into thinking about the underground world. We spend so much time in our gardens thinking about what's going on above the soil and all the plants that we're harvesting and watching grow. And I think the fall really invites us to move into this like subterranean world and consider what's going on underneath. If you're working with younger kids, these are a couple books I really like for shifting that thinking below the ground, up in the garden and down in the dirt. The book on the right there is awesome for just like really shifting that focus to what might be going on in the ground. If you work with older students, it can be also a great time to look more about soil type, soil composition, how soil is built. And SPECS, the same organization I was talking about, has some really good lessons for upper elementary and high school age students, all about soil testing activities. So check those out too. So we've talked a lot about garden cleanup and mulching, but maybe you still have crops in the soil and you're thinking, how can I preserve these a little bit longer to get a salad in November? Or maybe I want my kale to overwinter so that I can get those beautiful, tasty flower buds in the spring. So if you are curious about overwintering some of your crops and how you can protect them from the frost and snow, I have a couple tips I'd like to share. The first one is something called reamay or floating row cover, and I feel like this is a strategy that farmers use all the time, and gardeners don't often. I don't know if this like tip hasn't been passed on to gardeners, but I rarely see it in school gardens, and it can be an amazing, simple solution to overwintering crops. So floating row cover or reamay is this like plastic fabric. It's white. It lets light through, but it keeps heat in. And it also provides a physical barrier between the crops that are growing and the frost landing on them. It can make all the difference of a crop kind of surviving a couple degrees below freezing. And so especially if you're on that kind of the cusp of freezing, it can make a huge difference in your garden. It's also really simple to use. You can see in this picture here, it's stretched over hoops. I've also had it just laid directly on plants. You can see a garden I used to work with on the left there where students are laying it over the garden bed. I've also seen another school use old hula hoops to make hoops. If you can raise the reamay off the crops, that's ideal, but it can be a really simple solution. I often just put rocks on the edge to keep it down when the wind comes up. This reamay can be used also again in the spring. So all these season extension things we talk about, it can be great for protecting things from the cold in the fall, but also for getting an early start on your garden in the spring. If you want to step it up a notch, you can also consider making cold frames. The cold frame on the right there is a cold frame I made with a class as an ADST project. They really wanted to grow peppers, so we were looking for a really hot space to grow. And then we realized it was actually the perfect device to overwinter some of the crops that we had in the garden that year. These cold frames are just wooden frames covered with plastics. They're really lightweight and maneuverable around the garden and can be a fun hands-on project for students to make. And again, these cold frames can be used in the spring to start your seedlings or transition things from inside to outside as well. Lastly, I do want to talk, you're not too late to plant things this time of year if you're still wanting to get out in the garden and plant a few crops. The crops that are still an option right now are garlic. Garlic's a really easy crop to plant with your class. They're nice big cloves, easy for small hands. And you can look forward to harvest the next summer. Although garlic ripens in the summer, it's not ideal for the school calendar. The scapes, the flower stalks of garlic, are harvestable in June and can make a really good pesto. So if you want to incorporate that into a cooking in June, the garlic can be great for that. One other thing that you can, and if you're wanting some tips on garlic, we have our fall harvest crop cards, which will share a bit more information about how to plant those and how to harvest them when the time comes. Another thing you can still plant are fava beans, also known as broad beans. You can plant them this time of year. You can also wait and plant them in February. Either way, they'll kind of stay dormant throughout the winter, and then they'll shoot up in March and April. In addition to being a beautiful, delicious plant to eat in the spring, they also fix nitrogen. So even if you don't let them grow all the way through to harvest time, they're adding nutrients to the soil while they grow. They're also a great crop for seed saving. The seeds are really easy to save, and so it can be nice if you want a crop that connects students across the cycles of the seasons. Fava beans makes me also think of cover cropping. So one other crop you can plant this time of year is called a cover crop, also known as green manure. And this is the concept that if you have beds that are just fallow, that you're not going to be using throughout the winter or any other time of year, you can plant a crop in that bed that will preserve the soil, and then you can use later to add more organic matter to your soil. So you'd grow this crop till you want to use the garden bed again, at which point you would either just fork the vegetation into the soil, or you could tarp it to kill it and then incorporate it into the soil. It can be really hard to keep nutrients up in school gardens. It can be hard to get compost delivered, hard to keep fertilizers going. And so cover cropping is a really nice way of adding nutrients back to the soil. And it's also just nice, instead of having like bare soil, you have these nice green garden beds that offer more learning opportunities as well. Lastly, before I hand it over to Naomi, I just want to share a few thoughts on season reflection. So it's easy this time of year to get busy with other things, but it's also really nice to take a moment just to think about the gardening season and think about what worked, what didn't work, and some lessons learned to apply it, because spring's going to be here before we know it again. I'm always surprised how quickly the seasons blend together. So Farm to School BC through this program did create a season reflection outline sheet. This could be useful if you have a school garden committee and want to talk through the season and reflect on what worked and what didn't work in the garden. Also a time when you're doing this reflection to start thinking about some pieces that you might want to get ready for springtime. In particular, this is a time of year that a lot of grants are open for school gardens. Megan Zinni on her blog has an amazing up-to-date list of grants that are specifically applicable to school gardens in BC. So if you have a project that you need some funding for, if you're inspired to expand your garden, take a look at that list of grants because a lot of them are open right now. Speaking of open grants, it's the time of year that our Farm to School BC grants open. So head on over to our website, take a look at our grants. We've changed your application this year. You can now apply through 3 different methods. We really tried to make it accessible to everyone. If you'd like to learn more about the grants in addition to the website, you can also attend our grants information session coming up next Wednesday. Okay. I want to hand it over to Naomi now. She has so many wonderful things to share. And so I'm going to stop screen sharing here and pass the mic over and the screen over to Naomi.
Hello. So I'm just going to get my screen going here. And whoa, sorry. I just have one window that's blocking the other window, but we're almost there. Okay. So like Tessa said, I am here in the Cowichan Valley, so on the traditional lands of the Cowichan peoples, and I'm really grateful to be here. So I've been working with Cowichan Green Community for quite a while now, and primarily working at KinPark Youth Urban Farm. So I thought today I would just share some of the things that I'm doing in the garden right now and for the next few weeks, couple months, with the school groups that I'm working with, and just kind of hopefully spark some inspiration for activities and things to do. So very quickly, Cowichan Green Community is a not-for-profit organization that focuses on food security. So we do that through lots of different programs. And my program is focused on providing education, especially for young people, because they are our future. And I think that when young people have the skills to grow food, that feeds the community. It really kind of builds from there. And I think that's really important. So this is just a little visual context. So on the left there, that's KinPark. So that's a 1/4 acre market garden, primarily in ground beds, sort of traditional market garden format. But we have, the food forest, we have a community garden across the park, lots of edible landscaping, and it's a pretty unique space. On the right there is one of the school gardens that I'm working with this year at Queen Margaret School. So that photo was taken like 2 weeks ago. So that is what the garden looks like right now. So pretty full. It's a mix of annuals and perennials. It's much smaller. It's an intimate space, but it does the job really well. I think it's pretty cool to see how it's all coming together right now. So some of what I'm talking about, Tessa's sort of alluded to already. But at the start of the season, or the start of the fall season, I guess, we're thinking about what we can get in the ground, getting kids planting as much as we can. And that usually involves various greens, lettuce, kale, brassicas, cabbages, things like that. And what's really fun for us is to kind of explore like day length. So thinking about how the days are finally getting shorter, where in the spring, the days are getting longer, and there are certain plants that are triggered by those longer days to bolt and create seed. So things like lettuce and arugula, they can be a little bit challenging to grow early in the season. And so maybe some of those students were around in the spring, so they saw the lettuce bolt, they saw the arugula bolt, things that they were able to harvest for a short window. Well, now if they're being planted in the fall, they're not being triggered to reproduce. It's not that survival strategy. So you can have those conversations about the changing season. You can also explore like tender greens versus hardy greens. So kale does really well here all through the winter. It's very hardy. A lot of brassicas are quite hardy, but things like lettuce, they do not like to get too cold. So they might survive with a season extender, like Tessa mentioned, a greenhouse or a little remake can go a long way. We've had lettuce all the way into kind of early December just by keeping it covered with a little piece of fabric. So that's pretty inspiring for us. And then also just like exploring family relationships between different crops, because you can look at, what's the leaf shape, what's the shape of the seed head if you still have seed heads in the garden. If it is resistant to cold temperatures, what family is it a part of? How does that all come together? And of course, harvesting greens as a class is a lot of fun. We always try to taste things when we're in the garden. So cover crop, same thing. I'll be pretty quick on this one. I really like to take one of those seeds because it's so big. Like this is a fava bean. So a baby fava bean plant in the frost, and the seeds for fava beans are pretty large in terms of seeds. So we really like to use fava beans because of their large size. And I love to take that seed and show the kids and talk about how everything that plant needs to start growing is inside that one seed. So it can germinate just by having its own little kind of nutrient reserve inside that seed. And it won't need the nutrients from the soil for a little while. So it's kind of fun to just look at that tiny seed, which is pretty large, but it's something that they can see with their eyes. Counting, doing patterns and things like that. I actually just finished an activity with some kids today where we took different beans that were different colors, and I had the kids open up these pods not knowing what they were going to get. So then we got to explore the different types of beans, the different colors, and they got to start matching the beans and sorting them into the different varieties. Now this was like preschool aged children, so quite young. And in the end, they all got to take a magic bean home. So they all picked a magic bean that they wanted to take home. But that was pretty fun for them to explore the different varieties and textures and colors and all that kind of fun stuff. I also like to get them to imagine the weather. So right now it's cold, it's chilly. I ask them like, what do you want to wear in the winter? What do you want to sleep with in the winter? And they all say like fluffy pajamas, big blankets. And so we talk about how the garden also wants a blanket. The garden also wants to be protected. And so this idea of these cover crops, it's our way of giving the garden clothing. So it's not naked and it's protected, and we're helping to tuck it in for the winter. And then also like the nitrogen fixing, going through like, okay, so we're a little seed in the ground, and this plant has grown up into the air, and it's reaching, and it's grabbing that nitrogen and it's bringing it through its leaves down into its body, all the way down into the soil. And so you can kind of create it this like full body experience where the kids are doing those actions with you, and it's kind of really sinking into them, like, okay, where does the nitrogen come from and where does it end up? So that's a lot of fun. So planting garlic, Tessa mentioned this one already. And I would just say, I do know, so at KinPark, I'm here year round, so I'm able to tend a lot of these through the summer. But at the school gardens, Cowichan Secondary School is right beside us, and they have a school garden in addition to coming and working in our garden. And they plant garlic every year, and they actually harvest it a little bit early. They harvest it at the very end of June as kind of like their last garden activity. So it might be a little smaller than usual, but it works for them. And then they let it sit all summer, and in the fall, they all get together and they plant it again. So it is possible to incorporate into your garden, your garden format. Okay, seed saving. Seed saving is amazing. You can do this anytime. It doesn't matter if it's winter or spring. I love to have seeds on reserve as an activity to do when maybe it's pouring rain and you don't want to be in the garden itself. Maybe you want to be tucked under a tent or tucked under a tree. It's just a great activity to have all the time. So we typically do a lot of chickpea saving, kale, greens, fava beans, all of those guys. But you can make it as complicated as you want. And maybe it's not complicated, but you know, you can send the kids out into the garden looking and hunting for seed heads. And so maybe they bring all of these different seed heads back, and you start putting them in different jars and kind of identifying what plants those different seed heads came from. Or maybe you're just focusing on one plant for that day. The other day I was pulling chickpeas out with a high school class. And so we're all pulling these plants out and prepping the pods so that at some point in the next few weeks, we can go through and do the threshing and winnowing. So that's a lot of fun. They can compare the seed head structure to other plants within the same family or to plants that look completely different. It's also an opportunity for art. So you can see at the bottom there, that's our chaff man. So that was a couple of years ago, we were sorting through chickpeas. And so they'd gone through the threshing, the winnowing, had a blast. And then we had all of this chaff material. So that's all the kind of little stems, the casings for the pods, all of that extra material. So they decided to shape it into this man. And then they went hunting through the garden for other things to decorate the chaff man with. And they're never going to forget what threshing, winnowing, and chaff is. Like, this is now ingrained in their mind. So I love trying to allow for some flexibility in their time in the garden. It's not all super structured, because I think some of the learning is very organic. And I want to let them lead some of that. So this is just a video here of some winnowing. And this is like their favorite activity. So the video I didn't include was the one where two students are holding a big bag and he's punching it like it's a punching bag and just going crazy. It's just a fun way for kids of all ages. I've done this activity with 5-year-olds all the way up to like university students, and they can burn through energy and really just like remember where these seeds came from. So, okay, next. Spreading compost, again, depending on the garden, some people prefer to do this in the spring, some in the fall. We do a lot in the fall. So it's a great opportunity to explore decomposition. So on the top right there, the kids are looking in the compost. So we do have a compost on site. We do try to create our own compost to some extent. but we also bring compost in. So that's great. They're able to kind of see where the material starts, what it starts looking like. And then we have multiple bins. So throughout the year, we'll turn one pile into the next, so they can see the material starting to break down over time. You can also kind of talk about the microorganisms that are at work, the fungi, all of the different things that are coming together to cause that decomposition. You can also talk about those source materials, whether they're green, so like nitrogen rich, or browns, like carbon rich. And when we're doing that, it's kind of thinking, well, think of fresh, juicy, veggie scraps versus crunchy, dry. So some things like grass clippings, if they're fresh, those are nitrogen rich. But if you've laid them out in the sun to dry and they turn crispy, now they're kind of carbon rich. So it's a great way for them to start to get a feel for the balance within a kind of composting system. And they love doing it. They spread it using different tools. So they're starting to use like the big farm tools and the wheelbarrows and all of that fun stuff. And then the top left there, they were starting to realize like how compost, like what it feels like, and shaping it into different materials. And so they were doing, again, a little bit of art and decorating with some worms and all of that kind of stuff. So mulching, I also love leaves in the garden. And again, for us, it's really drawing those kind of comparisons around how we are comfortable in the winter, what we like to wear. We also talk about like weather. It's a great time to talk about the rain that we get, frosts, and how all of that impacts the garden. And you can even do comparisons where you have areas of the garden that you've mulched, or maybe they're just mulched naturally because a tree has dropped leaves. And you can say, okay, well, how does the rain impact the garden? And so we can do a little bit of, like, I call it detective work, where you're going and you're exploring the garden and you're comparing, okay, so there's a tree over here, or there's leaves over here, there's debris on the garden over here, but there's this other space that doesn't have any. And how has the rain impacted those two areas differently? Because we're trying to explain how, heavy rain is going to start to erode the beds. It's going to wash soil away. It's going to maybe cause compaction in certain areas where it just keeps falling on the same spot, and how those leaves dissipate that rain. They help to soften the blow. They also help to retain that moisture, which can help with that decomposition as well, and just like feeding the bed. So it's talking about these different components, because it's not just one thing, it's a lot of different things. And kids love doing that. You can even send them on a treasure hunt. Like, here's a bucket, walk around the garden, walk around the schoolyard, and fill it with leaves. And so then they're bringing back their buckets of leaves and adding it to the space. So there's a lot of other materials you can use as well. So grass clippings can be a popular one. Burlap sacks, if you can speak with like a local roaster or something, we do that a lot. It's quite an open site here, so the wind will kind of blow a lot of our leaves around as well. So if we can add burlap sacks on top of the leaves, that's kind of a bonus. Cardboard is also an option if you just need to cover things and keep the weeds down through the season. Worm bins. Okay, this is one of my favorite activities to do with kids. Again, you can do it anytime. I find fall is a great time because you have less going on in the garden maybe. And it can be depending on if you have a worm bin or not. If you don't have a worm bin, there's a lot of DIY resources out there, and you can get as complicated as you want. I'll often use just a single kind of Rubbermaid tote, and you can make the worm bin with the kids. So I teach them how to use the drill carefully to make some holes. I will task people with ripping up newspaper or cardboard, kind of gathering those materials to make the bedding. I'll also often send them on a hunt through the garden to find food for the worms. So we talk about what food is appropriate for these worms. So these are red wrigglers, so a very specific worm species that will actually live in a bin. So they get to go hunting and find the food that they like, which tends to be like leafy greens and carrot tops and other things that are mild and juicy. But then we talk about how they don't like citrusy things. They don't like spicy things, like hot, greasy. Some of those like comfort food burgers and fries, don't give those to the worms. They will not be happy. But off they go, and they'll come back with, you know, a leaf of kale or some grass or a dried leaf they found on the ground or a carrot or whatever it is. They come back with this little mix of food that they've hunted for, and then they get to feed the worms. I usually let them hold the worms gently, name the worms. We look at the life cycle, the different stages. We make comparisons to the juvenile worms and how juvenile worms eat a lot and they poop a lot, just the way the kids do, and the kids are juveniles. And then we talk about how, like, I'm an adult, the teachers are an adult, like we are able to have children, like we're able to reproduce, and like those differences between the worms, where the juveniles are, they're probably eating and pooping the most in that bin. So they're doing a lot of that decomposition work before they're fully grown. So they have a lot of fun, and anytime you can say poop to kids, that really gets them going. So, and then separating the worm castings too. So worm castings are great. If you ever have done research on fertilizers and things, a lot of fertilizers come in quite hot, and if you apply them to the garden before they have broken down fully, they can actually do some damage. They can burn your plants and cause some issues. Where worm castings, as soon as it's out of the worm, it's ready to go. So you can apply it to the garden at any time. We'll often kind of save them up and use them when we are propagating things in the spring. So whenever we start seeds, when we pot things up, we'll add some worm castings in. And it's just kind of a great way of doing small scale composting. So if you can't have a full compost on your school site, then maybe you can have a worm bin in your classroom and bring those castings out to the garden. Perennials are a great thing to do. So if you can build a perennial garden, this is a great time of year to do that, and even caring for those perennial gardens as well. So this is a picture of our herb border, which is in need of some attention, which is perfect because that's what's going to be coming up in the next couple of weeks. So you can have that conversation about the difference between annuals and perennials and biennials. So annuals are coming up annuals you're planting every season and then they die back and you have to plant them again. Perennials come back over and over and over again. And so that's a really interesting concept to a lot of kids. And then there's a lot of things like carrots where we treat them like an annual crop. You know, we plant them, we harvest them in one season, but technically they're actually a biennial because they produce their seed in their second year. We just don't tend to leave them in the ground long enough for that. It's great if you can plant some native perennials in as well. Harvesting herbs for meals is great, but creating habitat for native bees is really wonderful as well. So kind of that cross between native and non-native species is really fun. And you have a full garden that is lush throughout the year. And just a quick note on construction. I highly recommend it if you have the ability to build beds, let the kids use tools. They can measure things, use their math skills. They can learn tool safety if you feel comfortable teaching that. These guys in the middle are making a compost screen. So if you want to screen your worm castings or compost bin contents, that's really great. And other ideas, you know, sheet mulching, picking fruit. On the bottom here, the bottom right, those are blackberry canes. So Tessa mentioned the raspberry canes being left for native bees. And if you don't want to leave them in the bed just because of like tidiness or something, maybe the visual impact is important. We made these frames a few years ago, which look very intentional. So it's a great way of building something, making something with the kids, and it's still serving that same purpose. And that's kind of me in a whirlwind of information.
Thanks, Naomi. That was amazing. It's wonderful. I feel like you have your teacher hat and your farmer hat on, and you really kind of elevate how we can engage students this time of year in some very meaningful garden and farm work. I love the way you bring art in it too. I have never seen that idea of these like raspberry cane sculptures almost in the garden. What a neat way to combine construction, insect habitat, and garden cleanup all in one. We have about 15 minutes for Q&A with Naomi. So if folks want to put questions in the chat, we can read them out, or you can just unmute yourself, pop up your hand, and ask a question directly to Naomi that way. And yeah, so feel free to write those in chat. I can start off with a question just to get other people's brains going. I love your conversation about red regulars and compost bins, and I think it's a really neat opportunity for schools to bring some of that composting lessons into the classroom, especially if you don't have the space or the infrastructure for outdoor compost. One piece of that I'm just curious about, how do you source the red regulars? Where do you get red regulars for those compost bins?
Yeah. So I actually inherited this bin when I started the program. We had a bin that was already active. So that is, I think it's called the Hungry Bin. So that's the big green stand-up composter. And I believe you can get worms through them as well. Locally, I know we do have a composting business, Pacific Composting. And I know she provides red wrigglers. But it's mostly like online, do some research online and they would ship them to you, or have a friend who has a worm bin. At this point, when I'm building worm bins with other groups, I'm providing the worms out of our bin because they do reproduce fairly quickly. So if you have the right connections, there's also that option.
This sounds like an awesome Farm to School BC grant application to start a worm bin in your classroom and then provide worms to other classrooms and other schools. Just gotta plug that.
Love that.
Yeah, those are the sort of projects that we fund. Thanks, Naomi. That's great to hear that. I wonder if even like Facebook Marketplace, there's probably you could type in red.
Possible, yeah.
People might be out with them to share. Okay, I'm gonna open the floor. I see a hand up. We'll pass it over to Ro.
But yeah, I was just gonna say too, I know up here in Prince George, some of our pet stores even sell them. So yeah, you can also check there. Depends where.
Yeah, I think I've heard that like maybe as fish bait or something like for feeding fish or other creatures.
A crossover there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I know some there's a program up here in Prince George as well, and they make the worm bins that they take the worm bins over the summer and they have them in a giant worm bin and then they deliver them to the classrooms for the school year. And they made them out of like totes, just like the shallow totes, and they drill holes in the bottom and then they just lift them up on like tuna cans for drainage, like, and then they get the classes and the kids to make them too. It's pretty neat.
I actually really like that idea of returning them somewhere for the summer because I know that for a lot of teachers, that is the issue is it's like a class pet. You have it during the school year, but then someone has to bring it home. My sister's a teacher, so she has had class pets at home before as well. So I know some teachers do that with the compost bin at the end of the summer, they bring it home, but it would be awesome to be able to send it back somewhere else for a couple months.
Yeah, and if you can get a city organization on board, the bin is at one of our main city parks, so you can tell the kiddos you can go visit your worms all summer at the park. It's pretty good.
Those are awesome connections, Ro. Thanks for sharing those things. Other folks have questions for Naomi. There's one that just popped up in chat bar. It says, any other methods to prepare soil for fall planting other than leaf mulching? Thanks, Dover Bay Eco Club. Just a little shout out to Dover Bay Eco Club. They are an amazing student-led school garden in Nanaimo. Always so impressed at their perennial food forest garden. So nice to have you on the call today, Dover Bay. And I'll pass that question off to Naomi.
Yeah, I mean, just the way we prepare is generally just adding a little bit of compost at the beginning of the season or the beginning of the fall if we know we'll be planting in those beds. We'll do a small top dressing of compost. If you've had a cover crop in through the summer, that's great as well. You can come in, September, and the first thing you do is cut that cover crop back, maybe turn it in. But that's kind of all we do. It's just adding a little bit of compost before planting.
No, I mean, I like that you mentioned the cover crops. We often think about cover crops of like overwintering garden beds, but cover crops can be great to be used over the summer. And especially a school garden that might have a garden bed that's fallow for the summer, you can plant a quick growing cover crop like buckwheat or a clover. If you know you want to do fall planting and you want that bed to just be kind of maintained throughout the summer, and then tarp it a couple weeks before you want to plant it or fork it in. But cover crops can be a tool used year round. West Coast Seeds on their website has a really good overview of all the different cover crops that would be suitable in BC and the timing for those. You can take a look at that.
And another advantage there too is I know a lot of school farms or school gardens deal with a lot of weed growth over the summer because when you're not there to maintain it, the weeds can go pretty crazy. So adding a cover crop can often kind of suppress some of that weed pressure as well. Soil really likes to be covered. It doesn't like to be bare. And so that it's almost a survival technique to allow things to grow when it's not covered. So that's when you get all of these weeds and other things that naturally that is an important process to protect the soil. So if you can cover it with something of your choice, that's going to be helpful as well.
Thanks, Dover Bay Eco Club. Any other questions? While folks are thinking, Naomi, I think it's very interesting that you guys grow chickpeas at KinPark. I feel like that's not a common school garden crop, but a really interesting one. I think most students, if you ask them, what do chickpeas look like growing?
Yeah.
They would be really surprised. And so I think chickpeas fall in that kind of dried bean category, the plants that I love growing. And I think, Naomi, I appreciate that you bring that up. And it's a really neat school garden plant, even if you're not going to grow enough to be able to like harvest a sizable quantity to eat. It's still just a really interesting look at some of these plants or foods that are common in our cuisine, but not common in our growing environment.
And we do, when we grow the chickpeas, they kind of sit in the garden most of the summer. And so again, it's one of those, you planted it and it sits there. We do try to at least put some aside to make hummus or something with the kids. And even if it's not a large quantity, you're not providing chickpeas to the school cafeteria, but the students are able to actually see that this is where the chickpea came from and this is what it can turn into, and having that kind of full circle process is really enjoyable. We also have chosen chickpeas again because of the size. It's an easy seed for kids to process because it's big.
There's another question just in chat. It says, I didn't understand the raspberry cane frames on the last slide. Can you explain that part one more time, Naomi?
Yes, for sure. So raspberry canes, blackberry canes, a lot of those stems that have sort of like a soft pith on the inside, they are commonly used by native bees and little creatures to hibernate through the winter. And so a lot of people will encourage you not to take too much of your garden out in the fall. So you're not cutting too much back because we need that habitat for our native bees and insects, whether they're pollinators or parasitic wasps or other creatures like that need a place to hibernate. So raspberry canes and blackberry canes are quite a popular one. So we have a wonderful man, Ted Leichner, who's very passionate about native bees. So that was a project he took on with some students making these frames. And so using the raspberry canes or the blackberry canes and putting them on these frames, they're still available for the creatures to use, and it's easier to monitor them because it's right up sort of at face level, chest level. So you can actually inspect the canes and see, oh, has anything gone into this cane? And if you look at the top or the bottom, you'll see the holes where the bug has kind of like made its little nest inside somewhere. And so for TED, it's a great way to monitor that these species are active because you don't always notice as much when it's just like a pile on the ground. So we do leave a lot of material on the ground as well, but this is a great way to actually visualize what's happening with those native species. I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, the person said, thank you so much. That's fascinating. So yeah, I'm learning a lot from that too. And I just think it's a beautiful like art piece in the garden too. And a nice easy intro to construction. You don't have to have perfect measurements like building a full frame.
Yeah.
Nice to get kids using tools through that. We have about 5 more minutes for other questions. I can ask another question too while folks are thinking about adding another one to chat. Naomi, obviously you have a wealth of knowledge just gained through these years of experience, but are there any go-to resources you've found, either books you've read or websites you go to for lesson ideas or workshops you've attended? How have you kind of gathered this knowledge of engaging students in the school garden?
Yeah, there is a book, and I'm just trying to look up the name of it. There's a book by a woman. Okay, it's called Backyard Bounty by Linda Gilkison. And this was something that I really enjoyed. Like I purchased it a couple of years ago just because it talks about month by month the different things to do in the garden. So that can be really helpful, especially as kind of just like a base resource. And I still refer to it sometimes when I'm thinking about my crop plans or looking at like even my home garden. What do I need to do? Sometimes I'll flip through it quickly because it's helpful to have that seasonal direction. So I've really appreciated that. Trying to think of other resources that I refer to semi-regularly. Yeah, nothing, that's the one that jumps to mind right away, because that's kind of one of my go-tos, but.
Linda Gilkinson's amazing. If anyone else is on the island or kind of Vancouver coastal area, you can also sign up for her emails. So every couple of weeks, she'll send you an email of like, plant this now, watch out for a heat wave coming. I always really appreciate being part of her mailing list. Any other questions? Naomi, I think one thing that can be hard this time of year is encouraging students to still get outside as it's getting like wetter and colder into the garden. And you seem to really have a way of educating that gives a lot of space for curiosity and passions to unfold. Any other tips for how do you get that buy-in this time of year from kids outside?
I mean, encouraging movement is great. If they're moving around, they're going to stay warmer, which can be helpful. And I think the other thing is a garden lesson doesn't have to be like an hour long. So short is fine as well. When I'm working with the high school students, we do tend to be outside for about an hour and a half. Right now with my elementary school group, so I'm teaching kindergarten to grade 3 students, and they are 25-minute sessions. And that goes by so fast. They come in, we do a quick little like wander around. There's some sort of prompt for what to look for, what to try to observe. Today it was looking for slugs and trying to decide what environment do slugs seem to be found in? Like what's the reason that slugs are in that spot? But some kind of prompt for them to explore the garden for just like 3 minutes. Then we gather, we talk about the activity, do the activity for maybe 10 minutes, and suddenly it's gathering time and a quick taste, and they're gone. So short bits of time can be very productive as well. And then they're not outside for, an hour in the pouring rain. If there's a way to write into a grant for a little pop-up tent, I think that's a great idea, because if it is raining, as long as you have a base to hide for bits and pieces of the time, I find that really helpful for kids to be able to get a little bit of cover, and then they can go back out into the rain or the snow. I don't do a lot in the snow myself, because usually we've put the garden to bed by then, but it is snowing. A little cover is great.
A pop-up tent's such a great idea. I feel like we often
Yeah.
think about these like elaborate outdoor classrooms and needing big grants to be able to fund these spaces and getting school district permits and how do we build these outdoor classrooms. And a pop-up tent can go a long way, even a team building exercise to get students to set it up. So yeah, that's a wonderful tool for this time of year. Any last questions before we sign off for the afternoon? Well, thank you, Naomi. I feel like that was a really rich workshop for thinking about how we're engaging students this time of year in the school gardens. It really makes me wish you could just pop around to all these school gardens and offer workshops, because I feel like having that farmer knowledge is so valuable in this work. So thanks so much for coming today to share that. There'll be a follow-up email with all the resources that we shared, or you can check it out on our School Garden Mentorship webpage of the Farm to School BC website. And while you're there, check out our Farm to School BC grants too. They're open for another month or so. So take a look at those and get excited about what improvements you could add to your school garden this year. So thank you everyone for coming out tonight and enjoy the shift in season.
Thank you, Tessa. Thank you, everybody.